George stretched in his blanket and opened his eyes. Morning light filled the wigwam. Then he remembered the wild Indian dance the night before, and he sat up quickly. Loud talking came to him from outside, and he poked his head out of the wigwam flap, half expecting to see the Indians still gathered in a circle. But the circle was clear. Instead, Indians hustled busily around the camp. I must have overslept, he thought. Usually George went to bed early and was one of the first to wake up. But last night had been different. It seemed that he tossed on the dirt floor for hours while the Indians danced and chanted. The noise had slowly lessened as individual Indians must have wandered off. But not until then had George slept. Looking out the flap, George saw that some of the Indians busied themselves with unusual activity. Squaws stuffed dried venison and vegetables into sacks that the braves tied onto their ponies. Other Indians piled blankets and bundles of equipment on the ponies. George guessed that they were preparing to leave camp, and he noticed that most of these braves were the same ones who had traveled with him and Robert from home. George turned to roll up his blanket and saw Robert's eyes were open. Get up, Robert. I think we're leaving camp today. Most of the Indians we traveled with before are packing their ponies. Tears streamed down Robert's thin cheeks. Oh, I can't, George. I'm too sick. My head aches and my eyes burn. I wish Ma was here. Why, sure you do. I wish my Ma was here too. But she ain't. And there's nothing I can do about it. Not yet, at least. Then George laid his hand on Robert's forehead and felt the hot skin. I guess you really are sick, Robert, but you'll still have to get up. If only you'd eat, you'd probably get better. Then George left the wigwam and ran across the clearing to the field where the Indians kept their ponies. If he was going to be traveling, he might as well get his pony ready. When he reached the edge of the camp where the braves were packing their ponies, he saw that Robert's pony was already blanketed and ready. That's funny, he thought, but continued running toward the field. Just then a strong hand grabbed his arm and brought him to a sharp halt. Turning around, he was surprised to see it was Woonsack, who had grabbed him so roughly. Was Woonsack angry because George had overslept? What's the matter? George asked in the Indian language. You brave pale-faced papoose. You no go on this trip. Other pale-faced papoose, he go. George's eyes widened as he stared at the tall Indian. He realized Woonsack was telling him that Robert and he were going to be separated. Robert would go with the Braves on their trip, but George was to stay at camp. The thought that he and Robert might be separated had never come to him before. Who would look after poor, sick Robert? No, Woonsack. Robert is my friend. We go together. Woonsack just shook his head and impatiently motioned for George to return to camp. George slowly walked back to the wigwam and stood staring at Robert, who was still laying where George had left him. George pulled him to his feet. Come outside, Robert. You need the fresh air. Robert stumbled out of the wigwam and then slumped to the ground. Robert, your pony is ready to go with the Braves, but they won't let me get to my pony. They're going to separate us. Do you understand? Robert looked straight ahead, as though he had not heard. Robert, listen to me. I won't be with you anymore, but you'll be all right if you'll just act brave. You can if you try. You must eat the food they give you, and you must not cry. Robert still looked away. I might as well be talking Indian to him instead of English, George thought. He just won't listen. The thought came to George that Robert would never live to escape with him. He would more likely die from not eating and from constantly crying. Just then Woonsack appeared with two bowls of rabbit stew that he'd been boiling in big pots since dawn. He handed one bowl to George and the other to Robert. Then he stood watching the two pale-faced boys. George immediately pulled a big chunk of rabbit from the bowl and bit into it. Robert laid the bowl on the ground. Eat, Woonsack said to Robert. That's plain enough, George thought. He said it in English. I don't want it, Robert said. Eat, Woonsack commanded, louder this time. Then, seeing that Robert wouldn't move, Woonsack picked up the bowl of stew, pulled Robert's head back by the hair, and forced the bowl to his lips. With a fierce grunt of anger, the Indian forced the stew into Robert's mouth, some of it going in, but most of it spilling down the front of his already filthy shirt. Robert screamed and choked, but Woonsack forced him to drink more. Now other Indians gathered and they cheered Woonsack on. He forced Robert to drink still more of the soup until George thought his friend would choke to death. Finally, Woonsack jerked Robert to his feet, but Robert's legs crumpled under him. George covered his face with his hands and sobs shook his body. Then he heard Robert call, Go get your pony, George. Why don't you get it? They're waiting for you, George. Lifting his head, George saw that the Indians were dragging Robert to his horse. Robert continued to call for George to get his horse, and George realized that Robert had not understood anything he had told him earlier about being separated. He ran wildly after Robert, and Squaws turned to stare after the boy, who usually seemed so calm. At the edge of the camp, where the Indians were preparing to leave, George saw the Indians tying Robert to a pony. Then they mounted and started to ride, one brave leading Robert's pony. George! George! Robert screamed. The procession headed north, and George ran after them. Don't scream, Robert, he heard himself say. Don't cry, and remember to eat. Act brave, Robert. Please be brave. But the galloping ponies soon outdistanced the running boy. As the Indians turned a bend in the path, George saw one wave a tomahawk before Robert's face. Robert screamed the loudest scream George had ever heard. Then they were out of sight. George felt sure he would remember that terrified scream as long as he lived. For the first time, the Indians saw George cry out loud. When he returned to Woonsack's wigwam, he lay down on his blanket and cried himself to sleep. About noon, he rose and went to the stream to wash his face. He spent the afternoon walking in the edge of the woods that skirted the camp, and most of the time he continued to cry. George decided that he could never like the Indians. They had made his life miserable, stealing him away from his family and then separating him from his best friend. Maybe they've even killed Robert by now, he thought, and then began a fresh crying session. George didn't eat any food that day, and he barely ate the next day. But on the third morning, when he woke up, he began to realize how foolish he was acting. Why, I've done nothing but cry for 2 days, he thought. And I used to tell Robert how useless it is to cry. I must be making these Indians as disgusted as Robert made them. He rolled up his blankets and ran to the stream to wash. When he returned, he took the bowl of hominy that Woonsack's squaw offered him and quickly finished it. Then he ate a second bowl. George had not realized how hungry he was. Now he looked around the camp for Woonsack and realized he had not seen the big warrior since Robert left. What if Woonsack had gone too? Then he really would be alone. "Where's Woonsack?" George asked Woonsack's squaw. He could put together simple sentences now in the Indian language and at least make himself understood. "Woonsack go on hunt for deer and birds. He be back in a few days." Whew! At least Woonsack hasn't deserted me, George thought. Then, because he had nothing else to do, he began to help the squaw with her work. First, he helped her hang venison on poles to dry over a smoking fire. Then he helped her scrape the last of the meat from the dirt from the deer hides. The squaw smiled at him happily and patted his head a few times. George felt sorry that he had let the Indians see him cry. They would probably call him a papoose and a squaw. He decided that they would never see him cry again. From now on, he would be strong no matter what happens. Wasn't that how Pa had always taught him to be? Thinking of Pa brought his comfortable home and hard-working parents to mind with a sickening rush. What were they doing now? Did they think he was dead? What about Mrs. Stewart, thinking of him? If she knew he had let the Indians carry off Robert, would she understand that he could do nothing about it? More than anything, he wanted to escape from this dreary Indian camp. With his new feeling of strength and braveness came a kind of hardening to his heart. Everything he did from now on would be toward the purpose of escaping. First, he realized he would have to find out for sure from the Indians if they had killed his parents during the raid. Then he would have to find out in which direction his settlement lay. Finally, he would somehow have to find an opportunity to escape. When Woonsack returned from the hunt, he was pleased to see George helping the squaw. "Woonsack will make little Paleface brave a bow and arrow soon. Then Paleface can go with Woonsack on hunt. Woonsack show me how to make bow and arrow, and I will help him," George replied. George thought it might be a good thing to know for when he found his chance to escape. "We passed through good hunting grounds on the way to this camp," George said. "Which way did we come?" "We come from the south." Then George knew that in order to return home, he would have to travel south. Weeks passed quickly, and now, because Woonsack kept George busy, George helped George helped the squaw tan the hide from the deer Woonsack caught on his last hunt. He helped her tend to the corn in the field, dug roots from the forest for her to mix in the venison stew, and sometimes even watch after her little papoose when she had to be away from the wigwam. George guessed that this little papoose was only about 2 years old. Yet he already stood tall and was strong and plump with shiny black eyes. The baby looked very much like his father, Woonsack, and George thought he would probably grow to be a great warrior too. George often grew tired of doing squaw's work, and then Woonsack saw he looked bored. He would wave the boy away from the wigwam. "Go find other papooses," Woonsack would say, and George would seek out the other boys his age and play. As George ran about the camp, he learned to know most of the Indian braves. Many of them acted kind toward him in a stern sort of way. One day, an old brave slipped up behind George and handed him a beautiful whip made from plaited strands of buckskin of many bright colors. Another day, an Indian gave him a beaded belt. That same day, Woonsack took him to the field where the ponies grazed and told him to catch the pony he had ridden on the way to camp. George spotted the shiny brown and white pony on the other side of the field, caught him, and rode him back to Woonsack. George had grown fond of this sturdy animal that had carried him through the long journey. He knew the pony was a favorite of the Indians, and they called him Nico. Nico is yours, Wonsack said. He is yours to keep. Mine? Whoopee! George shouted and raced the pony around the pasture, for a minute sounding like a wild Indian himself. After that, George spent many hours with Nico, feeding him, grooming him, and riding him around and around the clearing. Sometimes he would trot the pony smartly through the camp. He sat tall and proud as the Indians and would loudly crack his new whip in the air. He'd show these Indians that he was just as good of a rider as the Indian boys, maybe even better. Soon after he had been given Nico, Woonsack had another gift for George. He held out a new buckskin shirt and trousers and a pair of delicately beaded moccasins. Woonsack's squaw make these for you, her do work, Woonsack said. This gift pleased George almost as much as the pony. He had worn the same clothes since leaving his settlement, washing them occasionally in the stream and enjoying a swim while they dried in the sun. But now they had big holes and were badly torn. George put on his new Indian clothes and paraded before Woonsack, who looked pleased. George knew that he looked like an Indian now, except for his light skin and hair. But he told himself fiercely, I am not an Indian. I am a white boy, the grandson of a colonialist from Germany. My name is George Augustus Bolin, and I am not about to forget that. Weeks turned into months, and as time passed, George was given more freedom. One day he decided to explore a path that led towards the south, toward home. Every day he rode farther and farther along the path, and every day he returned, he saw an Indian scout watching him closely. I will keep riding just a little farther every day, George decided. Finally, the scouts will think I'm just exercising Nico and he won't watch me so carefully. Then will be my chance. George realized that if he were to escape this year, it would have to be soon, for the weather would be turning cold shortly. Woonsack's squaw had no calendar like Ma had, yet George could tell from the ripening wild fruit and the falling leaves from the forest trees that it was nearly fall. They had even harvested corn a few weeks ago. He still didn't know if his parents lived, but even if they didn't, he would still want to escape. He would go back to Germantown and live with Grandpa and Grandma Bond. One day he rode Nico on the path that went south. He wore his warm Indian clothes, had an extra blanket packed on Nico, and carried the bow and arrows Woonsack had shown him how to make. When he came to the fork in the path where he had always turned back before, he stopped. Then he chose the path that led to the southeast and rode on. He rode slowly, for if Indians were watching him, he would not want them to be suspicious. Yet he had not seen the usual scout today. He rode what he figured must be a mile from camp, then another half mile. Now he was coming to a small hill. He kicked Nico with both heels and rode hard up the hill. Then on another higher hill to the right he saw the Indian scouts. The Indian sat quietly on his pony watching George with an expressionless face. George pretended not to see the scouts and rode a little farther. Then, as if he had grown tired of the ride, he pulled Nico to a halt, stretched his arms, and turned back to the camp. When he reached the wigwam, Woonsack's hard black eyes looked at him coldly. The scout must have reached here before me, George thought. Little paleface ride too far today, Woonsack said. Though Paleface might get lost, Paleface stay close to camp. George nodded his head obediently and walked inside the wigwam. That night he heard another powwow being held in the clearing, but the Indians talked softly, and he could not make out what they said. The next morning, squaws were taking down wigwams, and braves packed deerskin bags on their ponies. George knew that they were breaking camp. He wondered why they would break camp so close to winter. Well, it's too late now to worry about it, he thought. As long as we're traveling, there will be no chance to escape. I won't be able to go home this year, but there are always other years. These Indians can't keep their eyes on me forever.